Practical Anarchy, A Guide to Self-Determination, Dickie Dredd, and this is part 7 in the mini-series. And I suspect it will be a rather controversial one. Now, again, I must state, these are my opinions based on my research, we're not dogma, they're not rules, they're just discussion points for us to discuss. So, Anarchy and animal liberation, freedom without domination. Anarchism begins with an awkward question that never really goes away. By what right does some command others? Most political theory limits this question to human arrangements, states, bosses, landlords, police. Anarchism refuses that limit. Once authority itself is treated as suspect, its reach becomes harder to contain. The domination of animals, particularly in its industrial form, raises the same problem anarchism has always confronted: power exercised without consent, necessity, or accountability. Animal liberation, when taken seriously, is not a lifestyle accessory or a personal badge of virtue. It is a challenge to the assumption that some lives exist merely as inputs. Through an anarchist lens, it becomes part of a wider refusal of hierarchy, enclosure, and instrumental thinking. This does not require purity or moral uniformity, it requires coherence. I write this as a vegan, and as someone who has written a vegan cookbook. I mention that openly because hiding it would be dishonest, but I have never tried to impose veganism on anyone. Information matters. Coercion does not sit comfortably with anarchist ethics, and history suggests it rarely works. I'm also known as the worst vegan in my village because I have been known to eat a bit of cheese if it accidentally falls on my plate, but there you go. We're none of us perfect. Part 1. Early roots. Anarchism beyond the human. Classical anarchism did not always speak directly about animals, but its ethical foundations quietly opened the door. Peter Kropotkin rejected the idea that competition and domination were natural laws. In Mutual Aid, he argued that cooperation was a dominant evolutionary strategy in both human and non-human species. While this focus was social organisation rather than animal ethics, the implications ran wider. If domination was not inevitable, then species hierarchy could not simply be waved through as common sense. Leo Tolstoy pushed his connection further in practice. His Christian anarchism rejected state violence, militarism, and coercive authority, and he explicitly linked these to everyday acts of harm. Tolstoy argued that unnecessary violence towards animals was inseparable from violence towards people, and that ethical consistency required refusing participation in killing where it was not necessary. Abstaining from meat for Tolstoy was not a claim to moral superiority, but a refusal to live comfortably with contradictions. In late 19th and early 20th century radical circles, vegetarianism often overlapped with anarchism, socialism, and pacifism. This overlap was not because diet itself was revolutionary, but because both represented refusals, small, imperfect ways of stepping outside the systems that normalised domination. Section 2. From Ethics to Liberation, the late 20th century shift. The modern animal liberation movement took shape in the 1970s, influenced by ecological crisis, countercultural politics, and new moral arguments. Peter Singer's Animal Liberation framed animal suffering as a question of moral consideration rather than sentiment or tradition, introducing the idea that discrimination based on species membership may be ethically arbitrary. Singer was not an anarchist, but his utilitarian framework sits uneasily with anarchist scepticism towards abstract moral calculus. Even so, his work helped catalyse movements that were structurally anarchistic. Groups such as the Animal Liberation Front adopted decentralised organisation, affinity groups and leaderless action, rejecting formal leadership and central authority. Their tactics were controversial and often illegal, but they reflected a familiar anarchist conclusion. When institutions are structurally violent, appealing to them for reform may be futile. At the same time, green anarchism and social ecology sharpen the analysis. Industrial animal agriculture was no longer treated merely as an ethical lapse, but as a structural feature of capitalism, enclosure and mechanisation. Animals were reduced to units of production, in the same way workers had been, their suffering obscured by distance, bureaucracy and language. Contemporary practice beyond diet. Today, anarchist-influenced animal liberation operates across a fragmented but persistent range of practices. Grassroots sanctuaries, open rescues, hunt sabotage, mutual aid kitchens, community gardens and informal education projects exist without a single line or authority. This lack of uniformity is not a weakness. It reflects an understanding that liberation is situational rather than universal. Many of these projects deliberately avoid professionalisation, charity branding or NGO hierarchies. They are wary of funding dependency and the quiet pressure to moderate critique. Instead, they emphasise transparency, shaped responsibility and local autonomy. Progress is measured less in scale and more in durability. There is also increasing recognition that animal exploitation cannot be separated from human exploitation. Slaughterhouses are among the most dangerous and psychologically damaging workplaces, disproportionately staffed by migrant and precarious labour. Pollution from intensive farming is concentrated near poorer communities. These overlaps suggest that animal liberation is not a side issue, but part of a broader refusal of disposable lives. 4. Veganism, a tool, not a creed. Veganism occupies an uneasy place within anarchist politics. On one hand, it is the most immediate way an individual can reduce participation in animal exploitation. On the other, it risks becoming moralised, individualised and detached from structural critique. As I say, again, I am vegan, and I have written a vegan cookbook. I did that to show possibility, not to issue instructions. Food culture shifts when people see alternatives that are affordable, familiar and satisfying. It rarely shifts when people are told what they must do. Anarchism rejects enforced morality. When veganism is framed as obligation rather than invitation, it reproduces the logic of command anarchism has always opposed. People tend to change habits through understanding, exposure and practical support, not through guilt or threat. 5. When veganism is not possible. Any honest discussion must acknowledge material constraints. Not everyone can be vegan, at least not fully or immediately. Poverty, food deserts, medical conditions, caring responsibilities and cultural survival practices all shape what is possible in daily life. An anarchist ethic is not interested in identical outcomes. It is interested in good faith effort within real conditions, reducing consumption, avoiding waste, choosing less harmful options where available. These are pragmatic responses to uneven terrain, not moral failures. Purity politics fracture movements. Solidarity requires recognising difference without turning ethics into a status competition. Once again, anarchism is not simple. If anything, it is far more complex than societies organised by hierarchy. The point is not to be simple or utopian, but to be free. Part 6. Hunting for sport, domination, dressed as tradition. Hunting occupies a peculiar moral space in animal debates. It is often defended not on grounds of necessity but tradition, heritage or character. From an anarchist perspective, this distinction matters. Killing to survive and killing for leisure are not ethically interchangeable, even if the mechanics look similar. Subsistence hunting in context of genuine necessity raises difficult questions, and anarchism tends to resist blanket judgment here. Survival complicates ethics. Sport hunting does not. It appears to rest on domination as recreation. The animal is killed not to resolve scarcity, but to affirm control, mastery or status. The language surrounding sport hunting reveals this. Animals become quarry or pests. Killing is reframed as management. What disappears is the animal as a being with its own interests. This mirrors other hierarchies that anarchism has long criticised. Authority is most stable when ritualised, and violence survives best when renamed tradition. In the UK, hunting is closely bound up with land ownership and class power. Game laws historically criminalise the poor for taking food, while reserving killing as leisure for landowners. From an anarchist angle, this history matters. It suggests that sport hunting is as much about social hierarchy as wildlife. Claims that hunting aids conservation are sometimes partially true in ecosystems already distorted by human activity, but this is not an argument for sport. It's an argument for responsibility created by earlier damage. Celebrating the kill in that context risks confusing repair with entitlement. Attempts to ban hunting outright have often produced backlash rather than reflection. This does not mean harm should be accepted, but it does suggest that enforcement alone rarely reshapes values. Cultural change appears more likely when the stories that justify domination stop working. 7. It's quite a long section, this, because it's just a very complex section and it's misunderstood by many people. Health impacts of meat and dairy. Nutrition science is a bit of a street fight. A lot of evidence people quote is observational, and observational research can be minefield. Meat intake correlates with all sorts of other things: income, smoking, alcohol, exercise, fibre intake, overall ultra-processed food consumption. So when people say red meat causes X, it may suggest a relationship, but it does not automatically prove cause. With that said, there is one area where mainstream public health bodies are unusually firm: processed meat and colorectal cancer. The International Agency for Research on Cancer, part of the World Health Organization, classified processed meat as carcinogenic to humans, Group 1, and red meat as probably carcinogenic, Group 2A, based on its review of the evidence, with the strongest evidence for processed meat and bowel cancer. This does not mean an occasional bacon sandwich equals instant doom. It means risk appears to rise with regular intake, and public health advice generally leans towards reducing it. For cardiometabolic outcomes, type 2 diabetes, weight gain, cardiovascular disease, etc., the picture is more contested. Some large meta-analysis reports associations between higher intake of red and processed meat and higher risk of cardiovascular disease and diabetes, particularly in Western dietary patterns. But other approaches that try to get closer to causality, such as Mendelian randomized studies, sometimes find little or no clear causal relationship, suggests at minimum that confounding and dietary context may be doing a lot of the work in the observational findings. In plain English, a burger and fries lifestyle is not the same thing as a portion of beef in a whole food diet. The studies do not always separate those worlds cleanly. What is less ambiguous is the role of refined carbohydrates and industrial sugar in a metabolic disease. I used to run a website on low carb because I used it to reduce weight myself when I was in my 40s. Wrote a little book about it as well. But anyway, high intakes of sugar sweetened beverages are consistently associated with increased risk of type 2 diabetes and other cardiometabolic outcomes, and the broader evidence on high dietary sugar intake is generally unfavourable. For many people, the sharp end of the problem is not meat in isolation, but the modern diet's heavy tilt towards refined carbs, liquid sugar, and ultra-processed convenient food. Dairy is also mixed and context-dependent. Some studies report associations between certain dairy patterns and disease outcomes in either direction, depending on product type and population, while reviews have suggested possible links with some cancers. It's not a simple dairy bad verdict, and the honest position is that the evidence varies by outcome, dose, and what dairy is replacing in the diet. On plant-based diets, most major dietetic bodies accept that well-planned vegan diets can meet the nutritional needs across the life course, and they are often associated with lower LDL cholesterol and lower chronic disease risk in population studies. But plant-based is not automatically healthy. Ultra-processed vegan diets are absolutely a thing, and a plate of beige substitute can drift into the same metabolic problems as any other ultra-processed pattern. That is not an argument against veganism. It is an argument against pretending that labels do the work that food quality is supposed to do. This is where I get a bit opinionated, but not preachy. To me, a decent vegan diet is not about making fake meat the centre of the plate. It's about shifting the plate's logic altogether. pulses, grains, veg, nuts, fruit, herbs, proper meals. Substitutes can help people transition and can make certain dishes easier, but they can also keep the meat as default mentality alive, just with different packaging. With lab-grown meat and 3D printed novelty foods on the horizon, this debate is likely to keep rumbling. Context still matters, and it probably always will. 8. From an ecological perspective, environmental cost of animal agriculture. From an ecological perspective, industrial animal farming is among the most destructive systems currently operating. Livestock production contributes a significant share of global greenhouse gas emissions and is a leading driver of deforestation, freshwater depletion and biodiversity loss. Feed conversion efficiency means vast quantities of crops are diverted to animals rather than people, intensifying land pressure while global hunger persists. These outcomes are not accidental, they are structural features of profit-driven agriculture. Anarchist critiques of enclosure, extraction and monoculture apply directly here. Animal liberation is not only about reducing suffering, it is about restoring ecological balance and community control over food systems. 9. Why enforcing veganism usually fails. Attempts to impose veganism through law, moral policing and social coercion tend to backfire. Psychologically, compulsion produces resistance. Socially, it entrenches identity conflict. Politically, it invites caricature. More importantly, enforcement misunderstands the problem. Animal exploitation is not primarily the result of individual moral failure. It is embedded in supply chains, subsidies, advertising and cultural norms shaped by power. Targeting individuals whilst leaving structures intact reproduces the logic of punishment that anarchism has always opposed. Lasting change appears more likely when alternatives are visible and accessible, when plant-based food is cheaper, familiar and normalised, and when people understand consequences without being shamed. 10. Towards a non-dominating ethic. Anarchism does not promise innocence. Living within industrial society involves harm, often unseen. The question is not whether we are pure, but whether we are moving towards less domination and less violence. Animal liberation, approached anarchistically, is not about elevating animals above humans or demanding uniform behaviour. It's about dismantling a worldview that treats life as raw material. Freedom that stops at the species line is incomplete. Freedom imposed is not freedom at all.